Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Overcoming COVID-19 Through Sustainable Collaborations. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Zavala, and I'm a program manager for Candid, currently based in Queens, New York. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Chris Bunting and Diamond Rodriguez. Together, we'll be behind the scenes supporting today's webinar, collecting your questions that you ask along the way, launching a couple polls, and doing our very best to get to as many questions as we can, just with our limited time that we have today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we want to share a little bit about Candid. So for a combined 90 years, Foundation Center and GuideStar each helped change the world by giving people the information they needed to do good. In February 2019, the two organizations joined forces to become Candid. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that everyone should have the facts. The greatest service we can provide is to be upfront about all that we know. And we envision a social sector capable of tackling the critical challenges and opportunities of our time. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources that they need to do it. I'd also like to pause for a moment and say thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for today's conversation. Thank you for being a part of Candid's learning community. We know that these are challenging times for every one of us, so we do ask you to be gentle and kind if you do hear pets or children or construction outside the window. We're doing the best we can to get you the resources you need. And with that, we do have some resources specific to COVID-19 and racial equity, and we'll be sharing the links to those in the chat in just a moment. And in case you missed it, GrantSpace is now Candid Learning. Candid Learning is your all-in-one destination for all of Candid's live and on-demand trainings, webinars, and many other resources to improve your fundraising, overall sustainability, grant making, and transparency. And you can stay up to date with all of those resources by subscribing to our newsletter. At this point, we'd like to do a quick poll just to get a sense of who is joining us today, and the who is really going to be asking about your annual revenue size. So I'm going to ask Chris to please launch the poll for us. You should see it on your screen in just a moment, and take your best guess at where you think your annual revenue for your organization falls. And if you don't know, that's perfectly fine. You can either let us know that you don't know in the chat, or like I mentioned, just take your best guess here. Chris, how is participation looking? Should we give folks another second? All right, it looks like I have about 50% participation from the audience. So I'm going to give everyone another moment to make their most educated guess at where their annual revenue falls. And with that, let's go ahead and close the poll as we near almost 70% participation from the audience. And it looks like almost 48% of the group is at less than 500,000 for their annual revenue. We have about 12% falling between that 500,000 and 1 million mark, 14% between 1 million and 3, 12% between 3 and 10, another 13% that are over 10 million. Thank you so much for your responses today. We're going to go ahead and hide those results because I would like to introduce our panel. So at this point, I'd like to invite Jessica, Scott, and Tori to turn on their webcams and say hello to our audience, and briefly introduce themselves. And Jessica, let's go ahead and start out with you. Thank you for joining us and taking time out of your day.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with Scott and Tori, and I'd just like to thank Candid for setting this up. I'm Jess Cavanero, one of the partners at SeaChange, which is a nonprofit that helps other nonprofits with their complex challenges. I've been running our grant making work since 2012, and in that time have seen hundreds of transactions both across the country, but with a concentration particularly in New York City, and I'll be sharing some of my learnings here today.
All right, and I'll hand over the floor to Scott.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists and with all of you. I'm Scott Kotnoff. I'm one of the partners with Piana Consulting. We are a national firm that works exclusively with nonprofits and foundations in several areas, including a heavy emphasis on work with strategic partnerships. The firm has been in existence now for more than 2 decades, and during that time have worked with hundreds of relationships, close to thousands of organizations of all kinds, thinking about and successfully executing these relationships. And I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Scott. And definitely not least, Tori, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here today. And I'm probably like most of you who are on this webinar. I have been the Director of Development, the VP of Operations. I've done the marketing board member. And so today I bring the perspective of a CEO at Child Crisis Arizona. I've been through about a dozen mergers from all different perspectives. And I'm kind of that boots on the ground person. And so I will be able to answer any questions about what happens in a merger from my perspective. So I'm happy to be here and join this conversation. And I know it's really needed right now with all the organizations looking at partnership.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to our entire panel. We definitely wanted to make sure that we could have a more robust conversation. So Tori, having you on the line is definitely very appreciated. But to kick off our conversation, I actually wanted to give the first question that we have here to Scott, and we're really just starting out from the very basics. What are these various collaborations, partnerships, relationships that we're talking about today, just to ground our conversation and make sure we're all using the same terminology appropriately and get a sense of what these can be?
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. And I'll ask you, actually, we have a couple of slides, if you would please bring them up. And while the slides are coming up, just a couple of points that I want to make. All of us on the panel, all of you listening, use a variety of terms to mean similar or somewhat different things. One person's collaboration is another person's alliance, is another person's partnership. And so as we talk today, I really encourage you to not focus so much on the label and more on the characteristics of the relationship. And really what's important, and you'll hear, I think all of us stress, is that what's critical is to understand what you want to accomplish and then think about the kind of relationship, the characteristics of the relationship that help advance those goals. That being said, it is helpful to think in terms of different kinds of relationships, because often in this setting, our minds go immediately to merger. And that could either instill great excitement or considerable anxiety, or both. And so I wanted to just walk you through how we think about the various relationships. And so we have this graphic that we call the collaborative map, which outlines as we think of it, the universe of relationships. And just to quickly orient you, you'll see 3 rings, 3 circles, one in green, one in blue, and one in a sort of orange mustard color. And the way the diagram is set up, the closer into the center we go, the more structurally integrated the relationships become. And so as we look at the next slide and the outer ring, which we think of, and we use the term collaboration, and you see some examples, coordinated action, joint advocacy, et cetera. These are relationships that tend to be more informal, not necessarily have a contract or a written document which sets out the terms. Most likely there's no change in the corporate relationships or the corporate structure, no ceding of authority or autonomy or control or decision making. So for example, it may be setting up a learning community or a loose consortium of like-minded organizations, or there's a particular policy that's before a legislature that a group of organizations want to come together and do some joint advocacy. often short-term, not always a one-off relationship, but very often much shorter term than some of the others that we'll talk through. As we look at the middle ring, at the next slide, we think of these as beginning to move into more highly structured relationships, the terms of which are often set out in some kind of document, a contract between the parties, a memorandum of understanding. Here you see on the right of the slide several examples of kinds of relationships that start to fit this bill. There may be some tweak to the corporate structure, but not anything that really warrants a change in the board structure, the governance structure. We start here to have more shared authority, shared decision-making, shared autonomy, and a real sense of driving toward a longer-term shared goal. So for example, there may be 2 or more organizations that are looking to create a programmatic partnership that is about more than delivering just a one-off webinar, for example, but is about long-term delivering comprehensive services in a larger geography or to a larger community or deeper set of services to a population. And then finally, as we move into the center of the structure, here we get to where many of our minds often go to immediately, the concept of full organizational integration. Whether it's a merger, meaning 2 or more organizations fuse into one structure, or the creation of what we refer to as a parent-subsidiary relationship, which is essentially the creation of a membership corporation and a sole member relationship, but which in fact can operate and present itself to the community as one integrated organization, or the creation of a management services organization, what we refer to as an MSO. And that tends to happen when several organizations, for example, come together to deliver back office services. There's an organization that's very strong and has extra capacity around finances or around IT or program evaluation. These organizations come together to create a separate corporation that delivers those administrative services to the partners, and in some instances actually on a fee-for-service basis to other organizations as a way to sustain. And this enables the original partner organizations to really focus on their mission work while also ensuring that they have robust back office supports. So I realize this was kind of a quick overview and we can get into more depth as folks want, but just really wanted to give you all a sense that there's a wide range of relationship types, and it's really important to think about what it is you want to accomplish and then identify the structure that gets you there, rather than say, we want to create an MSO, or we want to create, we want to create a programmatic partnership and try and fit and pigeonhole what you're attempting to accomplish into that structure.
Thank you so much, Scott. Before I do move off of these slides, I wanted to open it up to Jessica or Tori. Any comments to add in terms of, what these relationships are and what folks should be thinking about?
I would just add that I think, to Scott's very good point, this is all about understanding what you individually want to do and then working through and letting that inform the legal structure. I think a lot of times organizations get hung up on the most legally accurate representation of what they're trying to do. And when you think about collaboration as a tool to increase and sustain programmatic work, the legal piece should really follow that mission first perspective.
The only thing I would add to that is the why, is to really look at the why. Why is your organization wanting to do this, wanting to do a collaboration, alliance? And so I really feel making sure that everybody on the team understands why is the most important.
Well, with that, Tori, I'm going to hand it over to you of, what does this look like in real life? What goes into actually setting it up? I'll let you kind of give us 2 cents, but I know Scott and Jessica are really the experts on kind of that portion of it, but I'd like to just, get your initial sense on that.
So there's a lot of work that can happen in order to figure out what structure your organization is going to be in. Is it going to be green, blue, or in the yellow? But truly, once that decision is made and everybody does the handshake or signs their name on the dotted line to make this official, that's when I feel the real work begins. Sometimes it's really easy for a board of directors, and I've been on those boards, to say, okay, we're going to do this, and all of a sudden we got everything signed and it's done. Truly, again, that's when the hard work starts. And so from day one, the most important thing would be a strong leadership team that is definitely in sync with the board of directors. So you need to have your vision out there. You need to have all of your goals written down, and you have to be on the same team, and you have to verbalize that. You have to put it in writing. You have to send it out there, because if you don't, depending on how many employees we're talking about, or board members we're talking about, or community members that don't understand the why, people are going to be everywhere. So I think the most important piece that I've learned over the years in the different capacities was making sure that we are all on the same page, and that we are all going to support moving forward and changing and growing. So kind of that second thing, so you got to have your team first, but there has to be consensus that you're going to embrace change, because what you thought it may be is not necessarily what it is going to be after you start to do the work and you peel back the layers on the onion. And so you can't have a board of directors or a leadership team that says, okay, once we're all together, we are going to make no changes, no staff will be laid off, we are not going to change any programs, because that never happens, and it's setting everybody up. And so I think we have to be more flexible after we decide what it is we're going to do. We have to be open, and we have to be flexible to allow that change to happen in real time. So those are 2 things I start with.
And now I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Great. So now that we're talking about the what and giving you previews into what happens, let's talk about where we start. And so, believe it or not, organizations occasionally call me before they call Scott. So I'm going to take you through what I tend to tell people before handing it off to Scott, who really does much of this facilitation work. And so when organizations call and they say, I'm thinking about pursuing a partnership, but I'm not sure where to start. I have all of these great ideas. What do? I say, go into a white room and write the word maker in capital letters across the board. Just because maker is a good acronym, but also because it starts with an M and everything is grounded in mission. And so I ask folks to ask themselves a couple of questions, first as an executive director, and then with their boards, to get aligned internally about what Tori referenced, why you're doing this work, and what Scott referenced, where you might want to go in order to use partnership as a way to advance your mission. So let's talk about the maker framework or the maker mindset or whatever it is that helps you remember this tool. So the M, what is your mission? How do you do this work? How does it impact your culture? How does it impact your approach to the programs? That's the first piece. And oftentimes you can have a little bit of tension there between what the executive director believes the mission is and what the board thinks the mission is. I know that at SeaChange, there was a point where among our 10 board members, we had a couple different versions of what we thought our mission might be. So starting with mission first and getting aligned there, always valuable. The A, what are your assets? Hard assets, soft assets. Real estate, endowment, cash, licenses, but also importantly, the value of your brand, the value of your team. About 30% of the transactions that we make grants to actually see that collaboration yields much stronger teams because they're able to recruit talent, retain talent, talk about their organization and their program in a way that just makes them more attractive to candidates that they otherwise might not have been able to recruit. So what are your assets? The K is for keepers. Very important. What is the special sauce of the organization? Is it your brand? Is it the way in which you do your work? Are you a consensus-based grassroots organization thinking about a partnership with a bigger institution that tends to be more hierarchical? Well, then your culture ought to be right up in front and center in terms of your keepers, and it's something that you ought to address up front. E, there's an event. So there's all this stuff going on in the world right now, but there's also probably stuff happening in shop. Is there a succession event occurring? Is there a change in your funding structure? Is there an opportunity to expand your program in a way that is important? And could a partnership help you advance toward that event? And then R, what is the reality? And this again is a place where we see a couple of different interpretations. So in terms of cash, in terms of time and capacity, because I am sure, as all of us will say multiple times, considering and actually planning and launching these collaborations takes a lot of time. Also, what's your reality in terms of partner? All of these collaborations are best built on trust. And how do you assess trust in a virtual environment? How do you get a sense for who your partner might be if you're only interacting on Zoom? So knowing what those are upfront, first as an executive director, and then among the board, will set you up for hopefully an easy first conversation with Scott. So Scott, I'm going to hand that off to you.
Thanks, Jess. And so assuming folks have done that thinking and followed that wise counsel, one of the things that's critical is for organizations to put all of the information together, the thinking that Jess laid out, the thinking that Tori laid out. So doing that initial internal assessment of where you are as an organization, what it is you do from a mission perspective, what your assets are, et cetera, and also why you think a relationship will advance your mission. And that's a different question than what is your mission and what do you hope to accomplish individually as an organization. And so we often talk with organizations about how to identify a potential partner and really try to expand their thinking away from their specific subsector. So for example, homeless services organization may come to us and say, we're thinking about, we think we need to partner, but we don't, we're not, we don't want to duplicate work of other homeless services organizations. And they haven't been able to expand their thinking to food and nutrition, health and education providers, other kinds of organizations, when brought together, can actually have greater impact than the individual organizations have separately. So that's one thing, is think creatively and somewhat expansively about who your potential partners may be and whose missions may be complementary to yours. And think intentionally about it. We're strong believers in getting the decision makers around the room and writing out the criteria by which you're going to evaluate potential partners so that everyone agrees on those criteria and knows what they are, and then doing some brainstorming and identifying the partners. The other important piece to think about is risk. Even in those situations where you have worked with another organization for many years, the CEOs have known each other for 25 years and everybody's worked together and good reputations, it's very different than moving into a more integrated relationship. And so it's important for your organization to be clear about your level of risk tolerance and to understand your potential partner's level of risk so that there's at least some alignment there. So you've done your initial analysis, internal assessment, you've identified a partner, and then it's time to explore. And the piece that, the final piece I'll say for this question is, we often encourage organizations to think about, particularly boards, to think about what it is you need to decide and understand to make the decision around whether to move forward with a relationship, which is different from what's the execution on the ground. The former, depending on the level of integration you're talking about, is higher level, more strategic, often more board involved. Once the board approves, then the focus shifts to the staff to really think about the nuts and bolts. What's the staffing look like? What do the operations look like? All of those pieces are best situated with the staff. But having that distinction between what do you need to know in order to decide whether to move forward, and what do you need, and focusing on that so that you can make that decision and then move into the execution stage.
Thank you both. We are getting a few clarifying questions in the chat on the MAKER acronym. So Jessica, could you run us through those again, and then kind of that a little bit more nuance on what keepers are for this one?
Sure. So M, mission. So what's your mission? How does that impact your culture, your approach? How do you define success? Assets. What are your hard assets? Cash, real estate, licenses, and your soft assets. Brand, legacy, value of your funder relationships, value of your team. The keepers. What are the things that you need to keep and preserve within your organization as part of any partnership? So sometimes that's brand, when you're thinking about that deep yellow mustard that's so wonderfully described. Sometimes it's your approach. Are you an organization that really values the way in which you connect with the community, and how do you maintain that even through some of the blue and green types of partnerships in that continuum or concentric circles that were referenced? So keepers are pretty important, also because they're a place where the board, and again, the executive director, or perhaps even the staff might differ. So having a strong sense of that up front, quite important. The E is the event. It can be a challenge or it can be an opportunity. And it's the question against which you ask, does this partnership help me solve for that event or advance towards it? And then the R is the reality, encompassing where you currently stand, both from a capacity and resource perspective, but also, as Scott very wisely referenced, in terms of your potential partners. Whom are the organizations with whom you have the best relationships? Can they appreciate your assets, honor your keepers, and help you solve or advance again towards that event?
Wonderful. Thank you for running through that again with us, Jessica.
Elizabeth, can I just jump in? Sorry, really quickly, just on the E portion of that. It's important for folks to really do a little bit of an orientation shift. That from our perspective and our experience, these kind of relationships are not crisis intervention tools. So if you're an organization that is facing, particularly these days, facing a potential cash shortfall in 3 weeks, this is not the discussion to be that you should be having. Rather, if you're the kind of organization that you're projecting and foreseeing growth opportunities and creativity in your organization, as a strategy, these tools these relationships are something to consider. And so it's just I just wanted to make sure folks are not sitting thinking, okay, so we're in a crisis, maybe I could merge. Well, first and foremost, as both Tori and Jess referenced, you're not going to complete a merger in time to resolve the crisis. But if there's a crisis, there's probably something else going on in your organization that you will need to address first before you can effectively move into a successful relationship.
Thank you for adding that insight, Scott, because I know that's definitely something that is on folks' minds, because we are in crisis and we are trying to figure out how to weather the storm and what what's 2021 going to look like? Are we going to make it to 2021? So I appreciate that. Tori?
Yeah, I
Boots
really
on the ground.
well, I really love the acronym. And another word that just keeps coming to my mind, one of the last partnerships, it was a potential merger, but the word that kept coming up, it was probably the K, but we were saying the deal breaker. And the other organization was saying the deal breaker. And that's kind of that line in the sand where it's like the board, the staff has made the decision, and this is a deal breaker. We have to have this, or we really want this. And you can't move forward if somebody goes over that line. So the deal breaker, keeper, typically that is what kind of will get in the way of making this, happen. And the other thing I wanted to mention is crisis, obviously. People, organizations, especially right now, are having a difficult time. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And when you talk about crisis, I have seen a few that are fine, but it's like, I feel like a partnership, a collaboration, a merger, an acquisition, whatever we want to call it today, it's a dance. And it's like dating. So whenever we start to talk to an organization, you start to date. And sometimes if you have a shotgun wedding, there's a reason that there's a shotgun wedding and there's a crisis at hand. And so the dating game is really important. So if you can think about this collaboration and this partnership as dating, you get to know each other, you ask questions, you do your due diligence. That's really what this is about. And I see that the successful partnerships are when organizations can date and they get to know each other's families. It's not just two people. It's everybody in the organization can talk, and they're open about it, and they're able to move forward at a pace that is very comfortable for everybody.
Thank you for that. Tori, let's stick with the conversation here with you. I know you've gone through a couple of these yourself. What has it been like on day one after, both families have come together, they've met, and, the dating turned into marriage?
So let's see, in the last one at Child Crisis Arizona, I was brought in post-merger as the new CEO, two longtime wonderful organizations, two sets of staff who had been there 30 years in some of the, both of these organizations. And, Team A and Team B, right? And now we're all one big happy family. But what was happening is the ink was signed that, okay, we're merged, and everyone said, okay, we're agreeing this is our new name. But it felt like a mixed family where you have a mom and a dad with children from two different marriages, and mom was eating with her kids at the table and having one meal, and then dad was eating with his kids at the table and having another meal. But not everybody was having mealtime together because they were used to doing it at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, or they wanted pasta and they wanted to grill. And what really happens is, everyone just kind of looks at each other and it's like, well, this works for us. 5 o'clock dinner really works for us, and we like to grill. And the other team is saying, well, we need to do this. And finally, as a new CEO, we just had to come in and say, you know what, it's not going to be a 5 o'clock dinner, and it's not going to be a 6 o'clock dinner. We're not going to grill, and we're not going to have this. We're going to create a new way to have dinner together, and it's not going to be this, and it's not going to be this. And that's really hard because people like to hang on. And so there might be an element of, the first dinner time and the second dinner time, and you put it all together. But truly, you're going to have people that are not going to be happy with the dinner because they are so used to what they want to eat and the time. And if they didn't truly come into this with eyes wide open, knowing that things are going to change and we're going to have to grow, and it's okay. That's the hard part. And so I think really just saying we can't continue to have dinner separately because that's not working. We need one operating plan. We need to be one way at an organization. That's the hardest thing for organizations, is to come together with one standard operating procedure and to come together as a team. So getting people at the table at the same time, enjoying the same food, is kind of the analogy.
Absolutely. And I know that sounds very familiar to me. You know, Foundation Center and GuideStar came together to become Candid. And we're learning how to operate as Candid, how to function as Candid. And you know, it's not always easy. Some of us like email and some of us like Slack, but you know, what's the organizational wide announcements? What platform are those made on? That's where everyone should look. You know, the teams are going to decide what the teams want to do, but when you look for an organizational announcement, look here for that announcement. And that's the way Candid communicates their org-wide announcements. So something as simple as that, you know, does take time to get people to used to email or Slack, and which one do you communicate on? So that definitely resonates with me, Tori. Anything to add, Scott or Jessica?
I would just really underscore this notion of culture, right, which is a big piece that Tori was talking about. One of the largest challenges around any change situation in an organization, and particularly on the more integrated kinds of relationships, this could very well be the biggest kind of change that an organization goes through. It's critically important to be intentional and explicit in talking about culture. And so one of the things that we encourage organizations to do is, when you're approaching the discussion, is first to think about this as creating something new, even in those situations where we have a $10 million organization and a $2 million organization, and the perception is, well, we're going to swallow you up. There's still something new that's being created. And so by approaching it that way and understanding that there will need to be the best of both brought together on things ranging from, you know, how and how often do we have meetings, and where are the organization-wide announcements versus where the teams go, and do we celebrate birthdays, and who makes decisions, and how are decisions, all of those things, and to actually begin those conversations as soon after there's some sense that the organizations are coming together, so that you're not doing it after the ink is on the paper. Because at that point, it can start to feel, for the staff, can start to feel like, wait a minute, how come we're partnering with these folks when we haven't even worked out this these elements? Which, you know, Elizabeth, I don't want to be a downer, but those things are going to could take years to work out and be comfortable in a sense that there's really a fully incorporated Candid way but just it's important to be intentional about culture.
The last thing I would add to that, because I think that's such a great setup, is that culture is different, or can be different, between the board and the leadership team and the frontline staff. And that frontline staff piece is so critical, because they're who engages with your beneficiaries. And at the end of the day, partnerships are all about ensuring that the programs continue and persist and are sustained and improved, all for the benefit of the people that you serve. And so taking the time to intentionally revisit and prioritize that cultural component for the people who connect with your communities is probably the most important thing that we should all be talking about all the time.
Absolutely.
If I could add to that, Elizabeth, one thing that we looked at, and over multiple partnerships, is everybody likes to say, well, this works really well, and historically we've always done it this way. And so hearing that over and over, maybe the first year or 2 years, we finally had to say, okay, time out. We want to celebrate what went well. And so we decided if somebody said historically this is what's worked well, we will celebrate that. So WWW. We do everything with a WWW, what went well. But we said, if you say what went well, you have to come up with an EBI. So everything we do now has an even better if. So we celebrate what went well, but at the same time, when we talk about what went well, we have to look at even better if, and then we have to fill in the blank. And so that's become our culture. We're celebrating what went well, but we're looking at what could be even better if. And when you frame it that way, people can truly get on board a little bit easier than always feeling like it's never good enough. Why do we keep wanting to change the way this is, going? And so the WWW and EBI is just something we do all the time. We use it in our performance evaluations now, and it truly works. And that's probably been the most beneficial thing we've done. And we are only 5 years post-merger at Child Crisis Arizona. But the even better if, wow, that has truly changed our organization.
Absolutely. All right. So, Jessica, my next question for you is, how can grant makers support collaboration amongst their grantees? And I'm going to switch this up on you a little bit. If you can actually speak to how grant makers can support organizations that do become one, and also, folks that decide to stay independent entities but work pretty intimately together.
Thank you for asking this question, because I don't think they're that different in the answer. I also, Tori, as you were going with the EBI, I'm imagining the notes from the session, and it's just a bunch of letters. This is alphabet soup. So apologies, but follow up with all of us for clarification on any acronyms. So how can funders support this work? This is actually a great story, because over the last 25 years, so the Lodestar Foundation out in Phoenix pioneered this work, but over the last decade across the country, funds have popped up to support sustained collaboration among nonprofits in New York, in Philadelphia, in LA, across the state of Arizona, in Chicago, and Dallas, and were formalized in something called the Sustained Collaboration Network. So if you're a nonprofit looking for funding, write down Sustained Collaboration Network, or SCN, to add to the alphabet soup, and Google that, because there are likely resources, or there might be resources in your community to support the work. But if you're a funder interested in doing this, I think the place to start is to understand why nonprofits call SeaChange or any of the sister funds across the country to get access to funding. And that's for 3 reasons. The first is to access expertise in how they might start to think about organizing themselves. So even before you call Scott, you call me when we talk about the Maker Framework. So 1, is there a place in your foundation, or is there a way in which you can connect a nonprofit grantee to a resource that is knowledgeable about this? Or can you support the building up of that capacity in your community? The second question to ask yourself is, do you have funding to support this work? So nonprofits call also because they want grants. But the things that we fund, if you'll excuse the analogy, are pretty far away from the heartstrings. So SeaChange makes grants to support lawyers, to support accountants, to support wonderful people like Scott, who do the work of facilitating and guiding the diligence processes, but it's explicitly not programmatic work. And so asking yourself, within your funding package, could you stomach writing a check to support a lawyer? If the answer is yes, okay, maybe you're pretty far along. The next thing to ask, and we've referenced this, I think, in the first 5 minutes, is your tolerance for risk. So when we think about this work, we think about, 1, there's a pool of funding available because you need to decide first if a partnership makes sense. So to use Tori's analogy, should you get engaged? Yes or no, but there's some upfront work that you might have to do, and there may be some third parties, again, lawyers, accountants, Scott, to bring in to help you figure out whether or not that makes sense. So half of the people that call are calling for that first bit of funding to help with diligence. And among that 50%, only half decide to move forward. Is that in line with our risk appetite? Yes. And are the organizations that decide not to move forward, how do we consider those? We consider those successful if they've learned something about themselves and their organizations as part of the process. And so that's where we get into this risk conversation. So as a funder, what's your appetite for risk? How do you think about supporting capacity or technical assistance? And if you can't explicitly cut a check, is there a way in which you can support TA and resource building in your community and get those things connected to the nonprofits that you support? The other thing that I think we have to acknowledge is that there is a little bit of influence, maybe more than a little, in power dynamics that can occur between an important funder and a nonprofit who's interested in this work. Imagine being a nonprofit leader who calls up their very important program officer and says, I have an idea. I think I may partner with another organization, but I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like. I don't know how much it's going to cost, but it's going to take a lot of effort to figure out. And also, please don't jeopardize the regular way general operating or programmatic support that you give me. I'll let you know when I decide. That is a very nervous-making endeavor. And so acknowledging upfront that that relationship exists and that there is some inherent tension in that, and thinking about how you might be able to package your very well-intended support in a way that promotes confidentiality and candidness and allows for risk-taking is where I would start.
Could I just add a quick thought, sort of like yes to all that, and even a step back, which is historically organizations, what we've seen is organizations have been reticent to approach funders about this, in part because of potential risk to their existing funding, but in part because it may signal to the funder that they're struggling as an organization. And so for those of you who are funders or who work with very closely with funders, the more this kind of conversation can happen in communities to normalize these relationships as a strategic tool, the more we'll see organizations feel like they can actually step into the conversation with their funders at a time before they're in a crisis. And so as a funder, excuse me, to sponsor these kinds of conversations, or even one-on-one for the program officer to raise it with their grantees. Have you thought about this? Is it something that interests you, et cetera? To just have it be part of the regular conversation to really normalize it and destigmatize the fact of having the thought, let alone the idea of asking for the kind of funding and support that Jess laid out.
I do want to make sure that we have sufficient time for our Q&A. So give me just one moment while we transition. And we have been getting plenty of questions coming in through the chat, and we've been doing our best to get to as many of them as possible. But I did want to pose a few that we did get at the point of registration. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Sticking to this grant maker theme, the question that was posed was, can you talk about the pros and cons of funders matchmaking collaborations and partnerships? Has this been done successfully, or is this something that perhaps nonprofits should be a bit more wary of?
So I'm going to start, but everyone is entitled to their own opinion. But I think matchmaking is pretty difficult. If you think about going back to the maker mindset, right? Mission is first. Mission, culture, keepers are the big ones. And so organizations that tend to come out of the process and decide to partner, at least for the portfolio that we've supported in New York, 94% have had pre-existing relationships between the executive director, between the board member, between the staff, And I think that's especially important now, because having a cold call and trying to assess these cultural pieces, which we all come back to as some of the toughest things that begin day one plus, is just really hard in this virtual environment. And so the short answer, at least from my experience, is that matchmaking is pretty tricky. And that if you have a sense of whom your best partners might be, that's probably the short list with which you'll be successful.
Yeah, I would add to that and say that your funders can be a good source of information about potential partners, because there may be other organizations coming to them and saying, you know, we're thinking about it. But I think to build on Jess's point, to rely more on the relationships you have with others is more important, is sort of the first source of potential partners, rather than look to the funder and say, can you hook me up? You know, that's like maybe as a secondary source if you're having trouble identifying partners, but primarily, what are your relationships?
And I might add to this conversation, just being on the agency end, this is like 20 years ago, so nothing recent, but we had some local funders that came to the organization that I was with and saying, you know, this other organization is similar to your mission, and you're doing similar type services, and they're struggling, and we really feel that they could benefit under the infrastructure of your organization. And so we will help to bring them over and give you, you know, the regular funding that both organizations would have for 1 year, but then it stops. And so sometimes everybody is really, you know, well-intentioned, but because it's two organizations, and let's just say hypothetically, they could each get $50,000 a year from a funder, and you have multiple funders, and they come together and then they say, we want this organization to come under the other one. You're not going to get the same level of funding. And so you have to figure out if you're going to be able to sustain that collaboration, that merger, that partnership in the future. And I think sometimes funders will look for 1 year and then there's no plan after that. So the organization has to be very careful and you know, do their homework and their due diligence to make sure that they have a business plan that can support you know, the fundraising efforts or the philanthropy needed to sustain new programs.
Another great question that we've actually got submitted by Patricia during our live webinar is, she wants to know if there are any strategies for mitigating risks of failure in these relationships once they are already underway. Are there any examples of early warning signs or reflection that, you know, they should keep an eye out for?
So I'm just going to go straight to what I think is the most difficult. I think the reality piece is important to get right early on. And I say this because there have been a number of situations where each set of organizations that were interested in a partnership had a different set of facts or a different reading on a situation that was driving them to be in a partnership discussion. And I think if you come at a negotiation with a fundamentally different view of what the challenges are and what the opportunities are, you're going to have a very difficult time working through and coming to an agreement on what a solution could be. And so there's one recent transaction in particular where there was a discussion around severance and pension. And one organization believed that what they were proposing was not a very big deal because as a percentage of the budget, it was not, at least in their mind, enough to be a deal breaker. On the other side, they had a very different view in terms of how the severance package, how the pension package would look as it relates to this moment in time in terms of social justice, in terms of where resources could and should be allocated. And that wasn't something that came up until the very end, when I think if you took a moment in terms of the reality piece of it and the keeper piece of it, you could have identified it up front and started to bring people together, or at least bring the discussion around this together earlier than in the 11th hour.
Yeah, and I would just add that, and this is a somewhat of a oversimplification, but in the for-profit sector, the process is often, let's look at the financials. The financials make sense. We're going to do the deal, and then we'll figure the rest out later. And in our sector, it's flipped, and it's really important to have those conversations around the why, around the culture, around the relationships, because that will surface those potential red flags or warning signs that you can either lead you to develop mitigation strategies, or to say, you know what, we love you, but we're going to go our own way.
Wonderful. With that, I want to pose one final question to our panel before we say goodbye to everyone. I'm going to make this one difficult for you guys. I'm going to ask for something short and sweet, but a great question that we got was, what was the biggest lesson you have learned as a leader? And I'm going to give this one to Tori first.
Ooh. Be strong, go with your gut if you're the leader. Ignore the haters. You can't make everyone happy. And as a leader, you're probably not doing your job if everybody is happy. And keep the, always keep front and center. There is no mission if there is no margin. And so truly, you do have to go back to the financial resources in order to continue the mission, in order to grow.
I think you may have given Jessica a new small key phrase there. So Jessica, I'll hand it to you. What's one of the biggest lessons you've learned as a leader in this field?
I'm coming at this in a place where I tend to skew towards numbers first. And so for me, it's always remembering that this work is about the people. People first, program first, beneficiaries first. And as long as we're doing something to uplift communities in need, then every day is a win.
Thank you for that. Scott?
So I would say yes to everything my colleagues have said, but also that the lesson that I've learned is that there are always lessons to learn, and that approaching leadership with humility humility and humanity are really critical pieces to being successful.
Well, thank you so much. It has been wonderful collaborating with the three of you on this session. I really do hope that our audience has enjoyed their time with you as well. And we definitely do encourage you to check out the La Piana site, SeaChange's website, as well as Child Crisis Arizona. Thank you for spending your morning or your afternoon with us. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Be well and stay safe. Take care.